Hello everyone, welcome to our third installment of our video series on the sociology of innovation and entrepreneurship. And this specific lecture is entitled Towards a Contemporary Economic Sociology of Innovation, where we will be talking about the different recent thinkers on innovation and entrepreneurship and how basically they move to our current understanding of sociology of innovation and entrepreneurship. So we're basically gonna be talking about different thinkers in the field of innovation and entrepreneurship. We're gonna spend some time with Schumpeter and how his understanding of economics has influenced the way we look at innovation and entrepreneurship. And then we'll talk about models of capitalism, and then we'll go specifically on how social networks influence the innovative capacity of an individual and of certain organizations. And the sources for this video lecture is from our book Ramelia on economic sociology of innovations. And you'll find it in pages 34 and 55. I invite you to still read this, even though I'm making a lecture on it, because there are a lot of very specific details that I won't be able to touch because they're too specific already, and I expect you to still read these specific details for you to be able to really understand the context of the thinkers that are going to be discussed in this video. So, as I explained, we're going to be starting with Joseph Schumpeter, and he's known to be a part of the Austrian School of Economics. One of his celebrated works is his theory of economic development in 1912. He is one of the heralded thinkers in the field of entrepreneurship. And in terms of economics, he championed on the non-economic factors of development during the time of 1912. When we talked about development, there was a lot of obsession about economic indicators of development, and modernization. Just for example, the GDP, or the gross domestic product. And Schumpeter argued that we have to look at economies and states in terms of the different other social factors that can influence why certain economic status of certain states look at this way, and how they eventually grow and develop as a nation. One of the things that Schumpeter was known for was that he had his own idea on economic development. And one of the first things that he talked about in his essay is that growth is what we usually measure in the current understandings during his time of economic analysis. That the current understanding is that there's a static theory of how economy is during the time, and there's just a circular flow of economic life, wherein there's a market equilibrium, the demand meets the supply and the supply meets demand, the profit is stable, the employment is stable, and that is kind of the nicest form of society that we have. That's the nicest way of understanding economic growth. But for him, in order for a certain economic system to develop, in order to say that there's development, then a certain form of disequilibrium has to be introduced into society. And according to Schumpeter, that disequilibrium is not something that is externally imposed. It's also something that is an initiative of the actors in that given economic system. And in history, we've seen that there are moments wherein we are in equilibrium, wherein our supply meets the demand and the demand meets the supply. But ever so often, there will be new introductions of new possible demands that would need new supply. Like for example, if you in the case of 10, 20 years ago, we didn't have internet yet, or social media was not yet a boom, so the demand for that was not yet very apparent, and so there was just economic growth, But there was really no economic development, at least at the side of internet and digital life. But now, because of there was that boom because of the introduction of the internet and the social media, and therefore a disequilibrium in the economic way of thinking about life has been introduced. And now we're seeing that we're kind of now putting the digital life and the digital sector into our equilibrium again. And then in the future, we will be expecting that another disequilibrium will happen. And that is basically how development will happen in a given society. So according to Schumpeter, during his time in 1912, traditional economic analysis fails to account for the radical changes that are the basis for the development process and the cyclical evolutions of the capitalist economy. So it's not enough that we just look at GDP, which was an obsession during that time. In order for us to say that a certain country is improving, we just look at the economic indicators. But according to Schumpeter, no. There are other things that we have to look at, and it's not enough to look at it this way, because there are many things happening in society that are not economic in nature in terms of the way we look at the indicators, but are influencing the economic system as well, and could be giving us clues in terms of a certain country's developmental status. And so that's the reason why Schumpeter was such an advocate of innovation in society, because that is the disequilibrium that he was talking about. That there are thinkers and there are actors in society that introduces new demands, that basically introduces or breaks the circular flow of economic life, and that is done because of innovation. This equilibrium is present, and therefore development is possible because of these thinkers and these innovators, which eventually we know as entrepreneurs. So Schumpeter also forwarded his own kind of typology of innovation. So according to Schumpeter, innovations could be production of new goods, it could be a new method of production or marketing, opening of new markets that weren't usually there, acquisition of new sources of supply and raw materials and intermediate products, or a reorganization of an industry. So if you look at these different typologies of Schumpeter, this is very much similar to our first video on the different categories of innovation. One of the most important contributions of Schumpeter in the field of entrepreneurship is the introduction of the phenomenon of creative destruction, which is very much similar to the creation of disequilibrium in an economic system. So according to Schumpeter, development takes place through industrial change that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one and incessantly creating a new one. And probably you've heard of the term disrupt. And this is kind of the 1912's version of that, creative destruction, introducing a new way of doing things in a society, in an economic system, trying to move away from the traditional way of doing it. And according to Schumpeter, that's an important element that we have to see in an economic system in order for development to happen. People have to be creatively destructive in a society. And who are these people? These are the innovators. These are the entrepreneurs. And then Schumpeter also introduced other aspects of innovation. One, it is not present everywhere in the economy at a given moment of time. So, but this is concentrated in particular areas. For instance, in the United States, the seat of innovation is in Silicon Valley, for instance. So there, and then of course there are certain industries where we really see this. Like in a rapid pace, in the digital industry at the moment, in the Internet of Things, probably also in biotechnology and gene therapy would be the areas that we have the concentration of innovation at the moment. Next, it tends to appear in clusters, nourishing other innovations in connection with it. So we know that when we talk about social media, we see that, for instance, when Snapchat was a big hit, suddenly we see other social media applications trying to mimic the Snapchat ways of posting. For example, Instagram had its own stories, Facebook has its own stories, which is very similar to the innovative posting of Snapchat during that time. And then now in Instagram, they have Reels, which I think is also an innovation that is inspired by TikTok. So and also when we a good example also of this is in terms of the building of ecosystems of certain digital brands. Like for example, Apple, when they think about innovating the computer, for example, the desktop computer, they make sure that together with the innovation of the desktop computer, there is also kind of an harmonized, innovative update into the smartphone, to the tablets, to the iWatch or the Apple Watch. So those are, this is what we mean in terms of innovation in terms of clusters. And then also, Schumpeter argues that innovation is cyclical in nature. So when a new innovation is discovered and developed and then it's delivered, and then eventually whatever that innovation has started, a new innovation will come out of it. So for example, the development of touchscreens in smartphones. So you have, so it has been designed, it has been delivered, it's been designed, developed, and then delivered, and then eventually the makers of the touchscreens did not just stop in terms of putting touchscreens in cell phones, but now we have touchscreens in desktop computers, and then and because of that, we now have touchscreens, for example, in large panels that we can find in restaurants, and then these restaurants you can already order from the large touchscreen panels. So that's the cyclical nature of innovation. So innovation breeds new innovation. And also, innovation is mostly related to the creation of new business. Thus, innovation is a thing that we need to understand for also understanding entrepreneurship. Because especially when we're looking at new avenues for profit in a given equilibrium in an economic system, we have to introduce some form of disequilibrium, and in order for us to do that, we have to innovate, we have to think of new demands, we have to think of new ways. And therefore, thinking of new ways, especially in the context of capitalism and in business, is where entrepreneurs can be found. And Schumpeter was very kind of thoughtful about entrepreneurs. And he was careful enough to differentiate the innovator entrepreneur with the people running the enterprise. So entrepreneurs is not equal to the CEO, because CEOs may just be overseeing the company and all of its operations, and making executive decisions for the company, but they may not necessarily be involved in the innovation itself. They could probably hire people who can do R&D for them, but they're not necessarily innovations. But they could be, they could be entrepreneurs, but there are CEOs who aren't really entrepreneurs. So the statement is entrepreneurs are not always CEOs, and CEOs or managers or top managers in a company are not always entrepreneurs. They can just be executives and top managers. Next, he also argued that not all entrepreneurs are inventors and not all inventors are entrepreneurs, because there are scientists, inventors who are just really compelled to make and develop new things, but they're not really interested in creating a business model out of the new things that they're created. And entrepreneurs, on the other hand, are interested in looking for areas wherein they could do creative destruction, find possible areas for profit, and make a business model out of it, or make a business out of it. So that's the difference between the entrepreneur and inventors. But what we do know about entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurs are innovators all of them are, no, but not all innovators are entrepreneurs. I hope that's at least from a business standpoint, I hope that's clear. Schumpeter also offered his description of who entrepreneurs is, and basically he describes, and I quote, "Finally, there is the joy of creating, of getting things done, or simply exercising one's energy and ingenuity," and that is an entrepreneur for Schumpeter. Schumpeter also argued that innovation happens and it is embedded in social institutional contexts. And according to him, no, the way entrepreneurs work or innovators work is based on two forms of capitalism, which is, first one is competitive capitalism and the second one is justified capitalism. So in competitive capitalism, innovation is introduced by individual entrepreneurs, new people who place themselves at the head of the new business. The typical industrial entrepreneur of the 19th century was a person who innovated by placing themselves as the head of the enterprise. However, for the justified capitalism mode of entrepreneurs or innovators, no, these are innovations that come from R&D labs of large oligopolistic companies that, especially in the United States, dominated capitalism from the beginning of the 20th century. So, who are these R&D labs? No, wherein we find the innovators. No, not necessarily entrepreneurs, but probably innovators. So one, Silicon Valley, for instance, no, this is where we find oligopolistic companies wherein most inventions or innovations really flourish. So we have Google, Apple, etc., etc. And then of course we have for human-related products. No? For example, we have Johnson and Johnson, pharmaceutical companies, no, who have large R&D labs whose goal is just to really shower money on scientists for them to be able to create new inventions. It's not really people who create their own inventions and then make their own company out of it. That's the first model, the competitive capitalism. The second one is, they have an organizational affordance, appropriation, like research and development committees or departments who do the research, or who do the development and innovation for the whole company. Schumpeter also talked a lot about Marx in his works, and he tried to differentiate the entrepreneur from the bourgeoisie. First thing is that not all entrepreneurs have the control over the means and the forces of production, and that's the first thing that's different. He also argued that being an entrepreneur is not a profession and not, as a rule, a lasting condition, and therefore entrepreneurs don't have their own social class. Although, of course, probably we consider entrepreneurs as a performance, as a role that needs to be performed in society. But I guess entrepreneur is a word that is being thrown around, even they don't know the legitimate meaning of it, no? So, but they're not comparable to a bourgeoisie who has the control over the means and forces of production. Now, moving away from the understandings of Schumpeter on innovation, and let's go into the different understandings of how the current capitalist models of society has influenced the innovative capacities of actors and organizations. So looking at the political economy of capitalism, which of course represents a line of study that analyzes the relationships of reciprocal influence between economic, social, and political phenomena and their modes of regulation in different institutional contexts. And political economy argues that there are varieties of capitalism, and we'll talk about 3 varieties of capitalism that is inherent in the world. The first one is the Anglo-Saxon model of liberal market economies, usually the neoliberalism, I would say. And basically, the Anglo-Saxon model is market-driven, while we have the Rhine model of coordinated market economies, which we usually see in northern Europe, no, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, and we also have that in East Asia, specifically Japan, wherein there is a limiting of market control in economic systems, and there, of course, there are social protection systems in place. So these are the welfare states that we know of at the moment. And we will talk about the third model of capitalism later. Let's focus first on these two because they're in terms of the history of developing of nations or in development. These are the countries that basically either entered the post World War II as an industrialized country already, or immediately or swiftly gained economic momentum after the World War II. Let's move to the work of Hall and Soskis, who put forward a relational view of companies, which are perceived as actors who need to develop their dynamic and innovative capabilities in order to compete effectively in the market. This depends on the quality of the relationships that they establish internally with employees and externally with a number of other stakeholders such as customers, suppliers, financial organizations, and public institutions. Now, in terms of that coordination, that relational aspect of companies, Hall and Soskis identifies 5 spheres. So the 5 spheres wherein we find or we nourish innovations or innovative capacities. The first one is industrial relations sphere, which basically handles matters related to wages and labor productivity. The second one is education and professional relations sphere, which basically helps in improving the human capital and necessary professional skills of current and incoming workforce in a company. The third one is corporate governance and financing sphere, which basically helps in support of innovation by investing and providing capital for the innovation to be incubated. Number 4, external relationship spheres, which talks about how certain firms deal with other firms, subcontractors, and customers in order to nourish the innovative capacities of a given organization. And number 5, the internal relationship sphere, which basically ensures the cooperation of employees and achievement of corporate objectives. So in the internal relationship sphere, this is basically influenced by the organizational structure, the vision, mission, and the strategic goals of the firm or the company. Now, in the conversations around how innovation is fostered or bolstered by capitalism, Mazzucato, on the other hand, argues that there is the role of the state in terms of influencing entrepreneurship and innovation. And so there in the conversations around innovation and innovative capacities, there's always that notion that the ones who are championing innovation in a given economic system or in a society are those in the private sectors because they're profit driven, and Mazzucato argues, no, we can also see innovation in the public sector, and also the public sector can influence innovation of innovators. And that will be the focus of the discussion in this slide. So we begin with the discussion on the difference between patient and impatient capital on a given innovative venture. Now, when we say patient capital, this is a type of capital that is provided to business ventures or innovative ventures, which we are not really sure what the return of investment is. So there's high risk, there is uncertainty in relation to whether we are really going to get our money's worth for the money that we are going to invest in a given innovative venture or research. Which is differentiated from impatient capital, which is provided to innovative ventures who has sort of a clear view on what the return of investment will be. There is already much information in terms of the area of study in that given research for us to be able to see that, yes, this research endeavor or this innovative endeavor will work. So that's impatient capital. They want ROIs and they want it fast. Patient and impatient. So there. And inventors or innovators will find themselves in a specific place wherein what they want to venture into is a risk situation or an uncertainty situation. Now, of course, all forms of innovation will have some form of risk. There's always that troubling feeling that, you know, I'm going to be working on this prototype, and this prototype might not work, or this prototype might not really make it really good in the market. It will not really potentiate the profit. No, so there's always that risk. But compared to an uncertainty situation, a risk situation compared to an uncertainty situation is that it's a little bit more clear. It's a little bit more predictable. The ROI is something that we expect. No, it is within the field of studies that we know can really the capital will be coming back to those who have invested in that idea, compared to uncertainty situations wherein when we venture into that innovative project, we're not really sure if it's going to work. We are not sure about the percentage of failure, and therefore it's going to need patient capital. It's going to need investors who are willing to put their money at stake, who are willing to say na, okay, I don't really care about the profit. I just want you to go ahead and do your research, you know. However, we need these uncertainty situations because when we go back to creative destruction, when we go back to, you know, the great inventions of our time, most of the great inventions of our time happen in an uncertainty situation. And the uncertainty situations of innovative ventures, they're more likely to be the solutions if successful, will bolster a new era, or will be able to give, you know, long-term solutions to problems. No? So that's the kind of the trade-off, you know, between a risk situation and an uncertainty situation. You know, a risk situation, I give you capital, I know that I'm gonna be profit about it because, you know, the risk is a little bit more predictable and manageable. Uncertainty, not so much. So for risk situation, it's usually provided with impatient capital, and your patient capital is usually provided with uncertainty. Now, if you are in the private sector, your goal is to be able to get more profit. So some companies may not be so sold in putting their money on uncertainty situations. Because, you know, if I'm going to invest in this R&D project, I want to get my money's worth, and I want to get my money's worth as fast as possible. Now, who's going to give the money or the investment for uncertainty situation projects that are needed by society but aren't funded by private institutions who provide impatient capital? But we need this for society. No, what are these uncertainty situations? There's so many things like related to climate change, right? So there are so many things that people are proposing for climate change, but we need money. No, so usually we go to philanthropists for this. But a more stable source of capital, of patient capital, should be coming from the state. Yeah, so state can support by funding forward-looking and uncertain research projects. So yung mga projects that are within the uncertainty situation but has a possibility to get us into a new era and solve more long-term projects, then it could be where the state can come in and fund these projects. No, at least in the Philippines, there are many institutions that can look into this. No, DOST. You know, if you're looking at it from the agriculture sector, you have the Department of Agriculture, etc., etc. And this is very nice because this is a very quite recent. No, if you can see, medyo HD na yung picture natin for our thinker, si Mazzucato. And because there's that contention that innovation is differently expressed in the public and the private sector. And Mazzucato argues, no, in the public sector, we can also expect innovative capacities to happen. And that states can be considered as entrepreneurial states. States that really provide a lot of capital on research, giving academia research to do projects that are found in the uncertainty realm, you know. And they can probably, of course, manage the risk landscape of the country. And entrepreneurial states, like for example, Japan, Sweden, who really provide money, for uncertainty situation projects, they are risk takers, and they shape the market as well. That gives more chance for the public sector to shape the market. Yeah. So the third type of model of capitalism, aside from the Anglo-Saxon and the Rhine model, is the development states, and we find the Philippines in the development state part, So these are the countries who experienced late industrialization after World War II, and they're characterized with a lot of borrowing of foreign technology rather than by generating new products and processes, And at least in the Philippines, we have a lot of that, we used to develop our own, vaccines, our own drugs, but we no longer do that anymore. Because again, we are not an entrepreneurial state. We don't really invest in future-looking projects. And bureaucratically speaking, as a scientist myself, there's a lot of hierarchical challenges in terms of accessing funds for research in the government, but just like the Philippines, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, we really developed ourselves as acceptors of foreign technology and just improving our human capital to be able to improve these foreign technologies, but not really, start our own technology. So kind of for developmental states, when you look at, journal articles, you would see that the neoliberalist states, they're more likely to bolster a lot of innovations compared to development states. Development states have the trait of autonomy, wherein, of course, the state is still in charge in terms of formulating medium and long-term developmental goals, without so much, of course, in principle, without so much intervention from the private sector and from the market economy. But at the same time, development states also demonstrate some form of embeddedness, wherein it also is able to build alliances with social groups, such as industrialists and private sectors, in order to improve. So the development state is both free from the market and also integrates the market into the development of their countries. Like for example, in the Philippines, we have a lot of public-private partnerships, so that's under embeddedness. But we know that the sovereignty of the state, that we live in a democracy, that the government are the ones looking at the long-term and the medium-term development goals of the country instead of market forces. And then we move to understanding agency factors in innovation. So this is the intentional action of public and private sectors to innovate, which includes the innovative capacities and organizational strategies of companies. So according to the work of Lester and Pior in 2004, the organizational capacities of a given organization is influenced by the extent and their strategies in approaching problem solving. And there are two processes that they identified. They have the analytical processes and interpretive processes. So analytical processes are the type of problem solving that we do when the problems to be solved are predictable and the possible results are well known. But in terms of interpretive processes, the decision alternatives are not possible because outcomes are not known in advance. So solutions, therefore, must be sought by exploring the frontier of innovation. So it is in the interpretive processes wherein we build innovative capacities more. Now, Dave Stark introduced the concept of dissonance in an organization. And dissonance basically says, the way I understand it, is that there are many people in an organization, and dissonance is when people in the organization do not necessarily agree with how things are done. And this is a fertile ground for innovation when within the organization's problem are sprouting because of these differences of opinions and intellectual capacities. And according to Stark, hierarchical organizations are the ones who take advantage of dissonance and are able to really improve their capacity to innovate by taking advantage of the dissonance in their organization. Heterarchy involves the following. One, the involvement of plurality of units in the innovation process. And this is why we are so obsessed, at least in the University, of interdisciplinarity. Because, when you work in a department and you work in one field and you already kind of predict, the problems being asked in your worldview and the solutions being done in your worldview, it's easy to not really think out of the box. But when you, put two people or three people from different disciplines together, you put an engineer there, a sociologist there, and probably someone who is into linguistics there, and then, you'll be able to because of that dissonance, the differences between your backgrounds, that plurality will be able to open doors for possible meeting of the minds, and that will be your possibility for innovation. Next is the strengthening of their operative interdependence through ongoing reciprocal monitoring. So in short, hierarchical organization really looks into or monitors the extent to which people innovate because of their dissonance. They put this in their strategic directions in the company. And then also hierarchical organization, they practice decentralization of decision making, because when you decentralize, the decision making is within the departments where there's plurality, there's more dissonance to be found there, and therefore there's a breeding ground, an incubator for innovation to happen. And also number 4, there's greater simultaneity with respect to the design and implementation phases of innovation, meaning all departments are allowed to have their own ways of innovating their products and services, and they do this they follow a certain strategic direction or a process or a procedure that is set by the company. Next, after looking at external macro factors and organizational factors that influence innovation, let's talk about more micro, how relations and networks foster innovation. Now, we can look at relationships or networks and differentiate them from formal and informal relationships. Long and short-term relationships focus on individual or collective actors, like for example, individual to scientists, collective actors to organizations or to firms, and then directed towards specific or more indefinite goals. Like for example, specific goals, there's a specific project that you want to do, or more indefinite goals like you are in an organization wherein, just innovate, be creative, and then, and then we'll count the creative outputs later. Also, in terms of understanding specifically innovative partnerships from these innovative networks, we can also categorize them whether they're transactional or relational. Transactional meaning we are having an innovative relation. We have a relationship in relation to innovation because we are bound with a contract, and we are, there is something that is needed to be done by both parties, or it could be just something that we have an informal relationship with. There's also different modes of governance. No, I think it's also based on the nature of innovation that you're doing. If this is a funded form of innovation, then I think you have to really answer to your funding agency. But if this is more of an informal innovation, then probably you don't really have to report from time to time the innovative process. And then we have the density of configuration, the extent to which there are weak and strong ties, and we'll discuss about that in a while. So basically, the argument is that there is a positive relationship between collaboration and innovation networks. So I think, even in the business side, one of the things that really bolsters innovation is collaboration. So while we applaud that there are certain inventors and innovators who have thinking by themselves, or developing things by themselves, but research has shown that more innovation is nurtured when people collaborate in an organization or inter-organization. And Granovetter, also one sociologist who thinks about networks, he argues that in relation to the density of configuration, people in an organization who has weaker ties are more likely to innovate compared to those who have stronger ties. And it kind of sounds counterintuitive at first, but it kind of makes sense, because when you will less likely be innovative with friends because you will have no attempt to challenge each other. I think that's the most basic way of saying it, compared to if you are in weak ties with them, you're working with acquaintances, and then you're coming from different backgrounds. Again, going back to the understanding of Sombart on social and the Simmel on social marginality. The more socially marginal we are to each other, the more tendency for us to want to have a common ground, and that wanting to have a common ground will more likely result to an innovative output. Yeah. So again, according to Granovetter, weak tie relationships, those with infrequent interaction, are more likely to spark a completely new idea. So if you are a manager in a firm, then there's always that don't group with your friends because do not have innovative groups within the department. Let's have a cross-pollination. When we create groups, we cross-pollinate. We get from one department to another, because research has shown that people will more likely be challenged to spark new ideas when they work with people who they have weak ties with. Also, within that understanding of social marginality comes in Burt, which kind of proposed the social origin of good ideas. And according to Burt, creativity is presented as information brokerage. It's a movement of an idea mundane in one group to another group where idea is new and valued. So for instance, this person A who knows B, who knows C, and who knows D, and B, C, and D has different areas of expertise, and A is getting to interact with them. A is able to see different perspectives, and therefore when that person gets to broker B, C, and D together, they are more likely to spark new ideas and innovations. Give me, for example, I am a nurse and I am also a sociologist. So I am tied with my networks with my sociology people and also and social scientists, and I am also tied with my nursing people. And there are so many ideas that I can provide to each group. Like for example, because I am the broker, I can bring my social research skills and teach them to nurses, and probably teach them how to do more socially inclined research methods like ethnographies or digital techniques, or data science. Not that I know data science, but that's just one example. And then also for sociology people who may not be as adept in terms of the different health conditions and health illnesses that sociology can get into, I can provide that, and then that will be able to spark new ideas. So that's the idea of brokerage, it is because of your different networks, the diversity of networks makes you spark more ideas, and that's why this is one of the things why sociology is really very an exciting area of study, because people who are more likely to have higher social capital based on their social networks are more likely to spark new ideas and have more better life outcomes for them. Next, we have Walter Powell. And then they argue that the effectiveness of partnership depends on very much on trust and the ability to learn new knowledge. So if you are an owner of a firm or you are a manager, then that's something that you have to develop among the employees. The ability to learn from external relations is conditioned by internal company resources in terms of knowledge and technical skills. So in short, if you want to be able to get new knowledge, you have to actively put in your strategic directions in your company, in your firm, to really put it as one of your outcome measures that we have to collaborate with other companies. We are going to put it in our metrics in our firm, and it's going to be one of our outcomes. So it becomes an internal thing. It becomes internally integrated into our organizational culture to be in that collaborative mode, to be in that mode wherein we are constantly and consistently looking for new knowledge. And then, of course, we have one of the probably more celebrated, and the first thing that you can think of as a thinker in innovation is Everett Rogers, and he introduced the division of innovation, another theory of innovation that discussed about social relations. So according to Rogers, an innovation is communicated through certain channels over time among the members of a social system. So basically, he's talking about the extent to which people get to adopt an new innovation. And he argues that, when you put down an innovation in an economic system, in a social system, in a social group or an organization, they won't necessarily embrace it immediately, And the argument is that if you put the people on a bell curve, you would see that 2% are the innovators or the innovative leaders, And then 14% are the early adopters or the opinion leaders. So probably when you think about that, let's say an Apple or Samsung drop their new products, you're going to give it to opinion leaders. So who are the opinion leaders in our time? The tech influencers or whoever influencer is out there, or the writers, And then the first one, we have the early majority, So the first one is the early adopters, the opinion leaders. Then we have the early majority, around 34% of the population who will get this and fall in line first and get these new technologies, Sila yung unang pipila pag alalabas na yung iPhone 13. And then we have the late majority who will just wait and see, before I buy this new product, I want to see the experiences of people first. So there's a 34% of people who are into that. And then we have the late adopters or the last adopters who are the resistant to technology. If they can get around not to use the technology, then they won't. And we've seen this pan out, in the abrupt transition from in-person to online learning, wherein those who are the late adopters are more likely to be dragged along, yung mga, because in the beginning, during the in-person classes, LMS was already available in our university, and some people are very resistant from taking it, because they have a choice not to take it, they have a choice not to adopt it, because the in-person classes is still going anyway, but when we abruptly transitioned online, they had to immediately adapt, and the late adopters are the ones who had a really hard time. There's another theory on the normalization of new technologies. If we have time, we can probably look into that. But at least in terms of the sociology of innovation, or diffusion of innovation, this is one of the more celebrated theories in terms of how people in a population, in a social system, adopts a technology when it first enters a market or it first enters a social system. There are certain societies who are faster in terms of diffusion, like for example the developed countries, no, they're faster to integrate because they have the money to buy it, no. At the same time, most of their society, the ecosystem of the society is already hooked to that specific technology. There are those who are not so fast, no, like for example in the Philippines, it took some time for us to be able to digitalize our world, no, to digitalize our system compared to developed countries. And there are those who are really slow, cultural laggards, like for example na for very obvious reasons, North Korea for instance, no, mas mabagal sila to diffuse technology in their area, no. And then of course finally we have Ramelia, who is the author of the book, who have compiled all of this sociological and economic thinkers on innovation, argues the importance of both interpersonal relations and interorganizational relation in bolstering innovation in a social system and a society. Companies need to balance strong and weak ties, no? So hindi lang the weak ties as argued by Granovetter earlier, but also we can also find innovation from people who have strong ties. Internal cohesion and variety in external relations. So variety meaning you have to have a diverse set of networks for you to be able to think of new ideas, and this is probably related to the brokerage theory earlier. In other words, the necessity of using complementary relationships and resources for innovation is very important to spark new ideas. And I think we're talking about this in a more organizational perspective. Yeah, it's true. The more you partner, the more likely you can spark new ideas. So that's basically the contemporary thinkers related to the economy of sociology of innovation. So we talked a lot about Schumpeter, and then we talked about the different models of capitalism, and then we talked about how relationships and networks influence and bolster innovative ideas.